"Don't ignore that drawing, sir," the small voice said again, trembling but steady, cutting through the polished silence of the glass-walled boardroom high above downtown Manhattan, where William Harrington, a billionaire known for precision and control, stood at the head of a long mahogany table surrounded by executives who rarely questioned anything he said. Yet at that exact moment his attention was not on quarterly projections or acquisition charts, but on a little girl standing near the doorway holding a folded piece of paper that looked too simple to matter in a room built entirely on things that looked important. Her name was Ava Johnson, 8 years old, small for her age, wearing a navy jacket 2 sizes too big and sneakers slightly worn at the edges, her hair neatly braided but slightly uneven as if done early in the morning by someone who tried their best. And yet her eyes carried a seriousness that did not belong to the room she had entered. William glanced at her briefly before turning slightly toward his assistant as if to silently signal that this was not the time, not the place, not the priority, because men like him did not usually stop high-level meetings for children holding drawings. But Ava stepped forward, just one small step that echoed louder than it should have in the marble stillness, and said softly again, "Sir, I think you should see this before you decide." A faint ripple of discomfort moved through the executives seated around the table. One of them gave a polite smile that did not reach his eyes. Another shifted papers as if pretending she was not there. William finally extended his hand without looking up fully, expecting something harmless. Maybe a sketch of buildings or colors or something a child might bring to a parent who worked too much. But when the drawing landed in his palm, something in the air changed without permission. It was a simple page, slightly creased, showing what appeared at first to be a building, a tall structure with familiar corporate branding. Harrington Global clearly marked at the top, but then William's eyes narrowed because the lines were too precise for a child's imagination alone, too intentional, and there were arrows drawn in faint pencil strokes pointing towards sections of the building that connected to something hidden beneath. Ava watched him closely now, her hands clasped in front of her as she continued, "I didn't draw all of it. I saw it. I saw them change the papers in your office." The room went quieter in a way that was not planned or controlled. William finally looked down fully, his expression still calm, but now sharpened by something subtle, curiosity perhaps, or irritation disguised as professionalism. One of the executives, Derek Collins, leaned forward with a soft laugh that tried too hard to sound light. "William, it's just a kid's imagination. You know how children mix reality with what they hear on TV? We shouldn't delay the merger discussion over this." But Ava shook her head quickly. "No. I saw the folder. I saw the signatures being replaced. I saw the numbers before and after." Her voice did not rise. It did not need to, because certainty does not always need volume. William lowered himself slightly now, placing the drawing flat on the table between financial reports and legal documents. Something about the alignment of lines on paper made his assistant shift uncomfortably, as if the drawing suddenly did not belong to the category of childish things anymore. Ava pointed gently at one section. "Here, this is supposed to go to Westbridge Holdings, but I saw it move to a private account." There was a pause, not dramatic, not loud, just heavy enough that even the air seemed to hesitate. William's gaze flicked to Derek for a fraction of a second before returning to the drawing. The smile that had been trained into him for public appearances faded almost imperceptibly. Ava continued, "I came here because nobody listened when I tried to say it outside. They said I was wrong, or that I didn't understand, but I watched it happen more than once. I remember the colors they used on the folders. I remember the stamp on the corner, and I drew it so I wouldn't forget." William finally spoke, his voice even, controlled. "What exactly did you see in my office?" Ava took a breath, steadying herself like someone much older. "I saw Mr. Collins take papers from the locked cabinet. I saw him replace pages before the morning meeting, and I saw him tell the secretary it was approved by you, even though you weren't there." A subtle tension tightened in the room as William slowly leaned back, studying her now not as a child interrupting a meeting, but as a variable he had not accounted for. Derek gave a short, dismissive exhale. "William, this is ridiculous. She's repeating something she overheard. This could be harmful misinformation." But William did not respond immediately. Instead, his eyes remained fixed on the drawing as if the pencil lines were rearranging themselves into something clearer the longer he looked. Ava's voice softened slightly, not pleading, just honest. "I didn't want to come here. But the papers I saw don't match what people are signing, and I think someone is trying to make you not see it. That final sentence lingered differently, because it was not accusation. It was observation. William finally reached for the drawing again, holding it closer, and for the first time the boardroom did not feel like a place of certainty, but like a place where something had quietly been misaligned for a long time without anyone noticing. Ava stood still waiting, not expecting praise, not expecting belief, just waiting for the moment where someone finally looked long enough to see what she had already seen. And in that silence, William Harrington, a man who had built his empire on seeing what others missed, began to look again at a simple drawing that should have meant nothing but somehow now meant everything. The room did not react at first, not because nothing had happened, but because everything had happened too quietly to be immediately accepted. William Harrington remained standing beside the long conference table, his hand still resting lightly on the drawing, as if it had weight far beyond paper, his eyes scanning the pencil lines again and again, searching for something his mind could classify as coincidence, imagination, or harmless misunderstanding. But the more he studied it, the less it behaved like any of those things. Ava stood a few feet away, her small hands now clasped tighter than before, watching him without speaking. Her presence no longer ignored, but not yet fully acknowledged either, like a question the room had not decided how to answer. One of the executives cleared his throat gently, attempting to reassemble the meeting back into order. "William, we are already behind schedule on the Westbridge acquisition review. We cannot afford distractions, especially not based on—" He hesitated briefly, choosing his words carefully. A child's interpretation, but William did not respond immediately. His attention had shifted fully now to the drawing, particularly to the small notation in the corner that Ava had mentioned, faint initials and a timestamp that did not align with any official documentation he had seen that week. He slowly sat down at the head of the table, still holding the page, and pressed the intercom button on the desk, his voice calm but lower than before. "Cancel the remaining agenda for this session." A brief silence followed, as if the room itself had not processed the instruction. His assistant glanced up in surprise. "Excuse me, sir. The merger briefing with legal and finance is scheduled to—" William interrupted gently but firmly. "I said cancel it." The tone was not loud, but it carried the kind of authority that made further questioning unnecessary. Chairs shifted, papers were gathered in uncertain motions, and within moments the large boardroom began to empty in an awkward quiet that felt heavier than any argument. Ava remained where she was, unsure if she was allowed to move or leave or stay, until William finally looked up at her directly for the first time without distraction. "Come here," he said simply, not harsh, not warm, just direct. Ava hesitated for only a moment before stepping forward, stopping at the edge of the table where the drawing lay between them, like a shared secret neither of them fully understood yet. William studied her face now instead of the paper, noticing details he had not registered before: the careful braids, the slight hesitation in her posture, the way she tried to appear smaller than she was, not from fear alone, but from habit, as if she had learned that being noticed came with consequences. "Where did you see this happen?" he asked. Quietly, Ava looked down at the drawing and then back up at him. "In the administrative wing on the 43rd floor, near the document storage office. I was waiting for my aunt after school pickup. I saw Mr. Collins go in with a folder that had the company's seal, and when he came out the folder looked different." William's expression remained controlled, but something in his eyes tightened slightly at the mention of that floor. Ava continued carefully. "I did not understand everything at first, but I saw the signatures change on the top page, and I heard him tell someone on the phone that it was already approved under your authorization." William leaned back slightly in his chair, his gaze drifting toward the glass wall of the boardroom, where the city skyline stretched outward in calm indifference. For a moment, he said nothing, and in that silence Ava did not interrupt. She simply waited, because she had already said everything she came to say. Finally, William spoke again, and this time his voice carried a quieter edge. "Did anyone else see you there?" Ava shook her head. "No, sir. I stayed out of sight. I did not want trouble. I just remembered what I saw and I drew it so I would not forget." The honesty in her words was not dramatic. It was simple and steady, and that simplicity made it harder to dismiss. William's assistant, who had lingered near the door, stepped forward slightly. "Sir, even if there is confusion here, We should let internal audit handle any concerns involving external assumptions, or William raised one hand slightly, not looking away from Ava. Internal audit will be involved. His tone remained even. But now there was a shift in direction, a decision forming. Ava watched him carefully, as if trying to understand whether she had made a mistake by speaking at all. But William's next words changed the atmosphere again. Show me exactly where you were standing. Ava blinked, surprised, and then slowly pointed toward the drawing again, then toward the building diagram she had sketched. Here, near the corner of the corridor, I could see through the glass door when it opened. William stood up, taking the drawing with him, walking toward the large wall screen. In the boardroom, he placed the paper beside it and compared it to the internal floor map displayed digitally. His eyes moving between both versions with increasing focus. Ava followed a few steps behind, unsure but attentive. The assistant and one remaining executive exchanged a glance, but did not speak. William zoomed the digital map slightly, then paused, his expression changing subtly as he noticed a detail that did not match standard access logs. He reached for his tablet, typed a few commands, and pulled up recent document movement records. Ava stood quietly, her heart beating faster now, not from fear, but from uncertainty about what she had started. William finally exhaled slowly, placing the tablet down, then looked at her again, this time differently, not as a disruption, not as an interruption, but as a witness to something that now required explanation. Tell me everything you remember, he said. And for the first time since she entered the building, the room no longer felt like it was ignoring her. It felt like it was listening. William Harrington stood still in front of the digital wall display, his eyes moving between Ava Johnson's simple drawing and the internal floor plan of his company headquarters, while the quiet hum of the boardroom felt different now. No longer the background of routine decisions, but something closer to tension waiting for direction. Ava remained beside him. Her small hands relaxed slightly as she realized she was being taken seriously in a way she had not expected when she first entered the building. William finally spoke again, his voice steady but lower than before. I want you to tell me everything exactly as you remember it. Do not guess, just what you saw. Ava nodded and stepped a little closer to the table, pointing again at the sketch she had made. I was sitting near the glass wall outside the document office. I saw Mr. Collins enter with a gray folder that had the company seal on it, and I remember because the seal was slightly misaligned. I thought that was strange. William's gaze sharpened at that detail because misaligned seals were not part of standard corporate stationery. Ava continued carefully. He was alone at first, then another man joined him. I could not see his face clearly, but I saw his badge. It was covered partially by his jacket. William turned slightly toward his assistant. Pull the security footage from the 43rd floor corridor yesterday, between 2:15 and 2:45 p.m. The assistant hesitated for only a moment before nodding and moving quickly to comply. Ava watched silently, her attention shifting between the drawing and William's calm but increasingly focused expression. William walked over to the conference table and picked up the drawing again, this time studying the arrows Ava had drawn more closely. They were not random. They connected the document office to a secondary hallway that led toward restricted storage access. He looked up at her. Did you see what happened inside the office? Ava shook her head. No, sir. I could only see through the glass when the door opened. But I saw him take papers out of one folder and place them into another. The assistant returned within minutes, tablet in hand, and placed it on the table. Sir, I have the footage. William took the device and played it immediately. The room fell into deeper silence as grainy security video showed corridor movement consistent with Ava's description. A man identified as Derek Collins appeared briefly entering the document office. The timestamp matched exactly what Ava had drawn. William's expression did not change outwardly, but his eyes narrowed slightly as he paused the footage, zooming in on a brief moment where another figure stood partially obscured near the doorway. Ava leaned slightly forward without touching anything. That is the second man I saw. He was waiting near the corner. He looked like he was making sure no one else came close. William resumed the footage, watching carefully as documents were moved between folders. His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. He set the tablet down slowly and turned toward the room, now fully aware that the situation was no longer speculative. Derek Collins entered the room again at that moment. Having been called back by the assistant under William's instruction, he smiled lightly at first, trying to maintain composure. William, I heard there is some confusion regarding internal files. I can assure you everything has been handled according to protocol. Ava instinctively stepped slightly closer to William without speaking, her presence small but steady. William did not respond immediately. Instead, he picked up the drawing once more and placed it beside the tablet screen showing the footage. The comparison was unavoidable. Identical structural markings, identical timing references, and now verified video evidence of unauthorized access. William finally looked up at Derek, his voice calm but firm. Explained the document transfers on the 43rd floor yesterday afternoon. Derek blinked once, then smiled faintly, as if amused by the seriousness of the question. I am not sure what you are referring to. I was reviewing standard materials for the Westbridge file preparation, nothing outside procedure. Ava quietly shook her head. I saw him take different papers, not review them. William raised a hand slightly, stopping further response from either side. His attention now fully focused on the pattern forming across the evidence. He turned back to the screen and replayed the footage again, this time slower, pausing at each movement. The room felt tighter, not because of noise or action, but because certainty was beginning to replace assumption. William leaned back slightly and spoke, without looking away from the screen. Secure all document logs from the past 72 hours and restrict access to internal audit only. His assistant immediately complied. Derek's expression shifted slightly now, a small crack in his earlier composure. Ava remained still, watching William rather than the screen, as if waiting to see whether the truth she carried would finally be acknowledged fully. And in that moment, William Harrington understood that what began as a dismissed drawing had now become the center of something far larger than anyone in that room had prepared for. The conference room on the 43rd floor felt different now, as if the air itself had become heavier after the security footage confirmed what Ava Johnson had described. William Harrington stood near the wall display with his arms crossed, his gaze fixed on the paused frame showing Derek Collins inside the document office, while Ava remained quietly beside the table, watching every reaction carefully, as though she was still unsure whether the adults in the room would suddenly decide to dismiss everything again. Derek stood across from them, maintaining a composed posture, but the earlier confidence in his expression had begun to fade into something more controlled and cautious. William finally turned away from the screen and looked directly at him, his voice calm but unmistakably firm. Explain again why you were inside the restricted document office without authorization at that exact time window. Derek gave a short, practiced smile and adjusted his tie slightly, as if the question itself was an inconvenience. I have already told you. I was reviewing merger preparation materials. There is nothing unusual about internal teams accessing documentation when deadlines are approaching. William did not respond immediately. Instead, he walked slowly toward the table and placed the drawing beside the tablet again, aligning the hand-drawn arrows with the digital corridor map. Ava stepped slightly closer to William, but remained silent, her eyes moving between both men. William continued. The security logs show you entering with an unregistered access key and leaving with a modified folder sequence that does not match any approved audit trail. Derek exhaled lightly as if amused. William, you are relying on a child's sketch and a partial camera angle. This is not exactly forensic evidence. I would be careful before escalating something that could damage internal trust unnecessarily. Ava's fingers tightened slightly around the edge of her jacket, but she did not step back. William turned his head slightly toward her, then back to Derek, his tone unchanged but now colder in precision. She did not sketch this from imagination. She described exact timestamps, exact floor access points, and document handling. Behavior that matches what is on record. He paused briefly, then added, and I have just confirmed that the file version you claim to have reviewed does not match the archived master file. A subtle shift passed through the room as the assistant standing near the door quietly confirmed another update on a tablet. William raised a hand to receive it, scanning quickly, then placed it back down. Derek's expression tightened almost imperceptibly. William continued speaking without raising his voice. There are 3 separate inconsistencies: access authorization, document versioning, and financial routing metadata embedded in the Westbridge acquisition file. Ava looked down briefly at the drawing as if relieved that someone was finally seeing what she had been trying to explain. Derek stepped forward slightly, lowering his voice. William, This is becoming unnecessary. Internal systems are complex. Discrepancies happen. We can resolve this privately without involving disruption to the entire division. William turned toward him fully now, his posture steady but authoritative, and said, "We are already past the point of private resolution." He then looked toward his assistant and added, "Initiate full audit protocol across all Westbridge-related transactions and restrict all outgoing document modifications until further notice." Derek's composure finally cracked slightly at the edges. "William, that is an extreme measure based on incomplete interpretation. You are letting external influence override structured corporate procedure." Ava lifted her eyes at that phrase, external influence, but she said nothing. William's attention shifted briefly to her, then back to Derek, and he responded, "Evenly. I am not relying on interpretation. I am relying on verified system discrepancies and cross-reference security data." He paused, then added, "And for the first time, I am also relying on someone who saw what everyone else overlooked." The room fell into a deeper silence as Derek's eyes flicked toward Ava for the first time with a clearer sense of recognition, not dismissal, but calculation. Ava instinctively stepped half a step closer to William without realizing it. William noticed this, but did not comment. Instead, he addressed Derek again. "Where exactly were you during the timestamp of 2:23 p.m. yesterday?" Derek hesitated for a fraction longer than before, then answered carefully, "In my office reviewing documents." William nodded slightly, then turned to the assistant. "Cross-check biometric entry logs for that office and compare with corridor footage." The assistant immediately began typing. The only sound in the room now was the faint hum of the city beyond the glass. Ava's drawing lay flat on the table, now surrounded by screens, reports, and digital confirmations that were beginning to align in a way that could no longer be ignored. William finally spoke again, not loudly, but with finality. "If the records confirm what the footage and logs are already suggesting, then we are not dealing with a misunderstanding. We are dealing with deliberate manipulation of internal systems." Derek's face tightened again, but he said nothing this time, and Ava simply stood still, no longer needing to explain anything, because for the first time, the truth she had drawn on paper was beginning to take shape in the real world around her. The atmosphere inside the 43rd floor boardroom had shifted from cautious observation into controlled urgency. As William Harrington stood beside the long glass wall with his hands resting behind his back, watching the live data feed his assistant had just pulled from multiple internal systems, Ava Johnson remained near the conference table, her small frame still and attentive, as if she understood that something important was now unfolding beyond what words could fully explain. Derek Collins stood a few steps away from the table, his posture still upright but less relaxed than before, his eyes occasionally flicking toward the door as if measuring possible exits from a situation that was no longer under his influence. William finally spoke, without turning away from the screen, his voice steady and precise. "Initiate a temporary suspension of all document modification privileges tied to Westbridge acquisition files until the audit team completes full verification." The assistant immediately confirmed the order, and within seconds notifications began appearing on the wall display showing access restrictions being applied across multiple departments. Ava watched the screen carefully, not fully understanding every technical detail but recognizing the seriousness in how quickly the system responded. Derek took a step forward, his tone now slightly sharper but still controlled. "William, you are escalating this based on unverified interpretation from a child who does not understand corporate structure or regulatory frameworks. This will trigger unnecessary scrutiny and damage internal stability." William slowly turned his head toward him, his expression unchanged but his focus absolute, and replied calmly, "What is damaging stability is not the verification process. It is the possibility that financial documents inside this company have been altered without authorization." A brief silence followed as the system display updated again, this time showing a flagged inconsistency between signed approval records and encrypted ledger entries. Ava instinctively looked up at William, as if confirming whether what she was seeing meant what she thought it meant. William noticed her reaction and gave a slight nod, confirming without words that her observation had aligned with the data. Derek's jaw tightened slightly as he shifted his stance. "William, I advise you to consider the broader impact of publicly questioning executive-level integrity Without a complete internal review, William walked back toward the table and placed both hands on its surface, leaning slightly forward, his voice still calm, but carrying undeniable authority. That is exactly why we are stopping all modifications now, so that nothing can be changed while we verify what has already been done. Ava stepped a little closer to the table, her voice soft but clear. I can show you where I saw him put the papers after he changed them. William turned toward her immediately. Go ahead. Ava pointed again at her drawing, tracing a line from the document office to a side corridor. He went this way first, then came back out alone. But the folder was different when he returned. I remember because the color tab was switched from blue to gray, and the seal looked freshly printed. William studied the drawing again, then glanced at the live map projection beside it. The correlation between her description and recorded movement data was now too precise to dismiss. The assistant spoke from the side. Sir, biometric logs confirm only 2 authorized entries in that office during the specified window. One matches Mr. Collins. The second entry is unidentified but registered under a temporary override key. Derek immediately responded. That is a system anomaly. Temporary overrides are common during system maintenance cycles. William raised a hand slightly, stopping him without raising his voice. Maintenance cycles do not include document reclassification or financial routing changes. Ava watched Derek now with a quiet intensity. As if seeing him more clearly than before, William turned toward the assistant. Isolate the override key origin and trace its issuance path. I want full chain of custody within the hour. The assistant nodded and moved quickly. Derek exhaled slowly, attempting to regain composure. William, you are allowing circumstantial input to override established operational trust models. This is not how you run a global enterprise. William looked at him directly now, his voice firm but controlled. I run this enterprise by ensuring that when something does not match the truth of the system, it is not ignored. It is investigated. A pause followed, heavy and deliberate. Ava remained still, but her presence felt more central now, as if the room had finally adjusted its focus to include her fully. William stepped slightly away from the table and addressed both the assistant and the room. Freeze all outgoing approvals tied to Westbridge until further notice. No exceptions. Derek's expression changed subtly, no longer just defensive, but increasingly uncertain. William continued, and bring an independent audit verification from outside the executive chain. Ava looked up at him at that moment, and for the first time, there was a quiet shift in her expression, not excitement, not relief, but a simple recognition that what she had seen and drawn had now crossed into something real and irreversible. William noticed this and lowered his voice slightly as he spoke to her directly. You did not just draw a picture. You identified a pattern that the system itself is now confirming. Ava nodded slightly without speaking, and in that silence the boardroom no longer felt like a place where decisions were made, but like a place where a hidden structure was beginning to reveal itself layer by layer under the weight of undeniable evidence. The 43rd floor boardroom had fallen into a deeper kind of silence, the kind that followed confirmation rather than suspicion, as multiple streams of data continued to populate the wall display in real time, each line reinforcing what Ava Johnson had unknowingly set in motion with nothing more than a simple drawing. William Harrington stood at the center of it all, his attention divided between the evolving audit feeds and the small girl standing quietly near the table. Ava's hands were now relaxed at her sides, but her eyes stayed fixed on the screen, as if she was watching her own memory being translated into something visible and undeniable. Derek Collins remained near the far end of the table, no longer attempting to interrupt, but his stillness carried a different weight now, less confidence, more calculation. William finally spoke, his voice steady and measured. The external audit team has confirmed the existence of an unauthorized access sequence tied to the document office system on the 43rd floor. The system is now isolating the affected data cluster for full reconstruction. The assistant acknowledged the update immediately, and the display shifted again, showing a branching timeline of document edits and access points. Ava stepped slightly closer to William, her voice soft but clear. That is the folder I saw. It was gray when he left the office but blue when he went in. William looked down at her briefly, then back at the data, and replied calmly, Your observation matches the version control discrepancy exactly. Derek finally spoke again, his tone more restrained than before. William, even if there is a mismatch in metadata, that does not automatically imply intentional manipulation. Complex systems generate inconsistencies under load. William turned toward him slowly, his expression unchanged but his focus absolute, and responded, system load does not generate consistent behavioral patterns across access logs, physical movement records, and financial routing changes all at once. A pause followed as the implications settled in the room more heavily than before. Ava remained still, but her posture had shifted slightly, as if she understood that what she had described was no longer just being considered, but actively validated. William walked closer to the wall display, reviewing a newly reconstructed sequence showing document transitions across internal servers, then turned back toward the assistant, Has. The external audit team isolated the origin of the override key. The assistant nodded. Yes, sir. Preliminary tracing indicates the key was generated from within the executive authorization pool, but rerouted through a masked administrative channel. William's eyes narrowed slightly, and he said quietly, rerouted by whom? The assistant hesitated briefly before answering. That is still under decryption, but the access pattern aligns with someone who has high-level clearance within the finance oversight division. Derek adjusted his stance almost imperceptibly, his gaze fixed now on the table rather than the screen. Ava looked between them, sensing the shift even if she did not fully understand the technical details. William turned back to the data stream, his voice now more deliberate. Lock all executive override capabilities tied to finance oversight until identification is complete. The assistant confirmed immediately, yes, sir, and executed the command. The system display reflected the restriction within seconds, showing multiple access points being sealed in real time. Derek finally spoke again, this time more carefully. William, I need to remind you that freezing executive override functions will impact ongoing merger obligations and regulatory reporting timelines. William did not look at him immediately. Instead, he spoke while still watching the screen. If those obligations are based on compromised documentation, then they are already invalid. Ava quietly stepped a fraction closer to William again, her presence small but steady, and said softly, I only wanted someone to look at it. I did not know it would become this. William turned to her fully for the first time in several minutes, and his expression softened slightly, not in doubt, but in recognition. You did exactly what was needed. You did not interpret. You observed. That distinction is what matters here. Ava nodded slightly, but said nothing. The room remained focused on the unfolding audit reconstruction, which now showed a clear sequence of document substitution events tied to a narrow time window. William addressed the assistant again. I want physical verification of every document stored in the Westbridge archive room within the next cycle. No digital confirmation only. Actual comparison against printed originals. The assistant confirmed and immediately relayed the order. Derek's voice returned once more, quieter now. William, if this escalates externally before we fully understand the scope, it will create irreversible exposure for the company. William finally turned to him directly, his tone calm but firm. What will create irreversible exposure is ignoring what is already verified. A brief silence followed, and in that silence Ava looked down at her drawing again, now placed beside official system reports, legal logs, and audit trails that all seemed to echo the same pattern she had captured in pencil lines. William noticed her gaze and spoke more softly. This drawing was not ignored because it was unimportant. It was ignored because it came from a place no one expected truth to originate. Ava looked up at him, and for the first time since entering the building, she did not seem uncertain about whether she belonged in the room. And in that moment, the system behind them continued to update, steadily and quietly, turning what had once been dismissed into something that could no longer be contained. The 43rd floor boardroom had now transformed into a controlled investigation environment rather than a corporate meeting space, with multiple live audit streams running across the wall display and encrypted logs being decrypted in real time by the external verification system. William Harrington stood near the center of the room with a still, focused posture, his attention moving between the cascading data lines and Ava Johnson, who remained quietly near the conference table as if she was trying to understand how something she once drew on paper had expanded into a system-wide investigation. Derek Collins was no longer speaking, but his presence remained tense, his hands now resting lightly on the edge of the table as he watched the unfolding data reconstruction. William finally spoke, without turning away from the screen. The external audit feed confirms a secondary routing layer embedded within the Westbridge documentation chain. It was not visible in standard access reports. The assistant immediately responded by updating the display, highlighting a hidden transfer corridor between internal finance storage and an off-ledger verification endpoint. Ava stepped slightly closer to the table, her voice soft but steady. That pathway is what I saw him use when the folder changed. William looked at her briefly, then back at the screen, and replied calmly. Your observation matches the reconstructed movement exactly. Derek finally broke his silence, his voice controlled but tighter than before. William, even if there is an anomaly in routing data, you are now involving external auditors in executive-level systems without full internal consensus. This could destabilize investor confidence if misinterpreted. William turned toward him slowly, his expression unchanged but firm, and said, Investor confidence is already compromised if internal documentation has been altered without authorization. Ava remained still, watching both men carefully. As if sensing that the balance in the room had shifted permanently, the assistant spoke again from the side. Sir, the audit team has isolated a complete version mismatch between archived Westbridge acquisition files and current active records, including 3 missing authorization signatures replaced with replicated digital entries. William's gaze narrowed slightly as he absorbed the confirmation. Then he walked closer to the table and placed his hand near the drawing Ava had made, aligning it visually with the digital reconstruction on the screen. Derek exhaled slowly and said, William, I strongly advise delaying further escalation until we conduct a controlled internal review with legal oversight. William did not look at him immediately. Instead, he spoke while studying the data. A controlled internal review is what failed to detect this alteration in the first place. Ava looked up at William at that moment, and for the first time, there was a subtle change in her expression, not uncertainty, but quiet realization that her voice had become part of something much larger than she expected. William turned slightly toward her and asked, Did anyone ever ask you to explain what you saw before today? Ava hesitated briefly, then shook her head. No, sir. They said I was mistaken, or that I must have misunderstood. William nodded slowly, then replied, You were not mistaken. You were the first point of detection. The room fell quiet again as the audit system displayed a newly confirmed timeline, showing coordinated file substitutions occurring within a narrow operational window. Derek's expression hardened slightly as he looked toward the screen. William then addressed the assistant, Expand the audit scope to include all executive communications linked to Westbridge over the past 14 days. Prioritize financial authorization chains and cross-reference with communication metadata. The assistant immediately confirmed and executed the expanded directive. Ava watched the system updates continue to flow across the wall display, now showing a clearer pattern of deliberate synchronization rather than random error. William finally turned back toward Derek, his voice calm but definitive. Until every layer of this system is verified, no assumption of normal operation can be accepted. Derek responded carefully. And if nothing conclusive is found, William paused briefly, then replied, Then we will have confirmed system integrity. But if something is found, then we will have identified the exact point where it failed. Ava remained quiet but attentive, her small drawing now sitting beside multiple verified data streams that mirrored its structure almost exactly. William looked at her again and said more softly, What you did by paying attention to what others ignored is the reason we are seeing this now. Ava lowered her gaze slightly, but did not step back. The assistant then spoke again. Sir, the audit team has flagged a recurring authorization pattern linked to a single administrative override signature that appears across multiple altered documents. William's focus immediately sharpened. Trace it to its origin. The assistant nodded and continued working. Derek's posture shifted subtly as the implications became harder to dismiss. William stepped slightly away from the table, his eyes fixed on the evolving data, and said quietly, We are no longer looking at isolated discrepancies. We are looking at a structured system of alteration. Ava looked up at him once more, and in that moment the room felt less like a boardroom and more like a place where something hidden for a long time was finally beginning to surface under the weight of undeniable confirmation. The 43rd floor boardroom had entered a phase where every second felt structurally significant, as if the building itself was holding its breath while the audit systems completed deeper layers of reconstruction. William Harrington stood near the wall display with unwavering focus, watching as the external verification system mapped out a complete network of unauthorized document alterations spanning multiple departments. Ava Johnson remained close to the conference table, her small presence steady but increasingly aware that the drawing she had created was no longer just a sketch but a structural match to a live forensic model unfolding in real time. Derek Collins stood slightly apart from the main group now, his earlier composure replaced by a quieter tension that was becoming more visible in the way he avoided direct eye contact with the screens. William finally spoke, his voice calm but carrying the weight of full confirmation. The audit reconstruction has identified a continuous override signature embedded across multiple Westbridge acquisition documents. The same signature appears in financial routing changes, approval logs, and archived version edits. The assistant immediately highlighted the signature chain on the screen, showing a repeated identifier linked to a masked executive access profile. Ava stepped forward slightly, pointing at the screen without touching it. That is the same pattern I saw when the folders were being switched. It always happened right after he left the room. William looked at her briefly and responded with quiet precision. Your timeline matches the verified system sequence within a margin of less than 2 minutes. Derek finally turned toward the screen again, his voice lower now, but still controlled. William, you are making a leap from pattern recognition to attribution. System signatures can be duplicated or spoofed under compromised network conditions. William turned toward him slowly, his expression unchanged, and said, system signatures can be spoofed, but coordinated behavioral timing across physical access logs, biometric entries, and document version control cannot occur without intentional orchestration. A silence followed that felt heavier than before as the system display shifted to show a consolidated map of document flow across multiple servers. Ava remained still, her eyes tracking the movement lines. As they converged into a single origin point, William walked closer to the screen and studied the convergence node carefully, then turned to the assistant. Isolate the origin point of the override signature and trace its first recorded appearance. The assistant executed the command immediately, and within moments a highlighted node appeared on the display, marking a secure executive access terminal located within the Finance Oversight Division. Derek's posture shifted subtly as the location appeared, but he did not speak. William observed the node for several seconds before speaking again. This terminal requires dual-layer authentication and biometric clearance. Correct, the assistant confirmed. Yes, sir, William nodded slowly, then said, and yet it is identified as the origin point for all unauthorized modifications. Ava looked up at William at that moment and asked quietly, does that mean someone inside the system had access the whole time? William paused briefly before responding, it means someone with authorized access chose to use it in a way that was not recorded as intended. The room fell into a deeper silence as the implications settled across everyone present. The assistant then spoke again, sir. The audit system has now confirmed that all altered documents share a single time synchronization window between 2:14 p.m. and 2:30 p.m. across 3 consecutive days. William's eyes narrowed slightly as he processed the consistency. Derek finally spoke again, his tone more careful than before. William, even if there is a single point of unauthorized access, it does not automatically indicate broader structural compromise. William turned toward him and replied evenly. It indicates control of a critical access point was used repeatedly with precision timing across multiple systems. Ava stepped slightly closer to the table, her voice soft but steady. I remember that timing because it always happened right after the afternoon staff change, when the hallway was quiet. William looked at her and gave a slight nod. That detail is now confirmed by the system logs. Derek's expression tightened as he looked at the floor for a brief moment, then back at the screen, where the override signature map was now fully expanded, showing multiple linked modifications across financial, legal, and executive documentation layers. William spoke again, his tone measured but final. Expand the investigation to include all personnel with overlapping access permissions during the identified window. I want a complete mapping of physical presence, digital access, and communication logs. The assistant confirmed immediately and began executing the expanded directive. Ava remained quiet but attentive, watching as the system transformed her simple drawing into a verified forensic model spanning multiple departments. William turned slightly toward her and said softly, "What you observed was not isolated. It was the first visible point of a structured pattern." Ava lowered her gaze slightly, but did not step back. Derek stood in silence now, no longer offering objections, as the system continued to compile and refine its findings. And in that moment, the boardroom felt less like a corporate environment and more like the center of an unfolding revelation that could no longer be contained within assumptions or oversight. The 43rd floor boardroom had reached a point of complete procedural lock, where every system connected to the Westbridge acquisition was now being actively audited, traced, and cross-verified in real time. William Harrington stood at the center of it all with a calm but immovable focus, watching as the final reconstruction layers of the override network converged into a single verified timeline on the wall display. Ava Johnson remained near the conference table, her small hands now resting lightly at her sides, her eyes fixed on the screen, as if she was watching the full meaning of her drawing finally take shape in a form she could not have fully imagined when she first sketched it. Derek Collins stood several feet away from the main display, no longer speaking, his posture still upright, but now entirely still, as if every possible argument had already dissolved in the face of confirmed system evidence. William finally spoke, his voice steady and clear. "The audit system has completed full reconstruction of the document. Modification chain. All altered Westbridge acquisition files originate from a single coordinated access point using a masked executive override signature." The assistant immediately brought up the final consolidated report on the wall display, showing a complete sequence of document changes, access logs, and financial routing edits, all converging into one origin node. Ava stepped slightly closer to the table, her voice soft but certain. "That is exactly the pattern I saw every time the folder changed color. It always looked normal at first, and then different when it came back." William looked at her briefly and responded with quiet precision. "Your observations match the verified transformation points across all documented revisions." Derek finally turned fully toward the screen, his voice lower now, controlled but strained. "William, even with a single origin point identified, there are still procedural requirements before assigning responsibility within executive oversight systems. Correlation does not establish intent." William turned toward him slowly, his expression unchanged but his tone firm. "Correlation establishes pattern, and pattern establishes deliberate action when repeated consistently." Across secured systems, a brief silence followed as the final audit layer loaded, revealing a time-stamped map of every modification event. Ava watched carefully as the lines on the screen formed a complete structure that mirrored her drawing almost exactly. William walked closer to the display and studied the final node, then spoke to the assistant. "Identify the exact user profile linked to the masked override signature." The assistant paused briefly as the system decrypted the final layer, then responded. "The signature resolves to an internal executive authorization profile registered under restricted administrative access." William's eyes narrowed slightly as he absorbed the confirmation, and he asked, "Is there any secondary authentication trail associated with this profile?" The assistant responded immediately, "Yes, sir. There are multiple secondary authentication entries that bypassed standard verification through internal override protocols." Derek's expression tightened slightly as he looked away from the screen for a moment, then back again. William spoke again, his voice now carrying finality. "Lock all associated accounts pending full external review and preserve all forensic data in immutable storage." The assistant confirmed and executed the command. The system display reflected immediate restrictions being applied across multiple executive access points. Ava looked up at William quietly and said in a low voice, "I did not know it would go this far. I just thought someone needed to see it." William turned toward her fully now, and his expression softened slightly without losing authority. "What you did was not just seeing it. It was identifying something the system itself failed to flag until now." Ava nodded slightly, but said nothing. Derek finally spoke again, but his voice had changed, no longer defensive, now restrained. William, if this level of internal compromise is confirmed externally, it will trigger full regulatory escalation, William replied calmly. Then it will confirm what the system has already verified internally, that there was unauthorized manipulation within critical financial documentation. The assistant stepped forward slightly. Sir, external audit supervisors are requesting confirmation of findings before escalation to board-level disclosure. William paused briefly, then said, transmit full verified audit reconstruction, including time-stamped access logs, document version history, and override signature mapping. Ava stood quietly as the transmission process began, watching the screen shift from internal system view to structured audit report format. William turned slightly toward her and said in a steady voice, the reason this matters is because truth inside a system must always remain traceable. Ava looked up at him, and for the first time since entering the building, her presence felt fully acknowledged, not as an interruption, but as the point where the entire structure of hidden activity had first been revealed. And as the final audit confirmation completed its transmission, the boardroom no longer felt like a place of uncertainty, but like the exact moment where concealed actions had finally been brought into full visibility under undeniable verification.